been quite a year. This is our last colloquium, and we're going to resume again in September. And we're going to have Professor Dan Schnur back in September, and you could mark your calendars for that. And when I look over this year, Professor Schnur started our year back in September of 2016. And you might remember Dan Schnur is the director, he's from USC, he's a professor at USC, but he's also the director of the LA Times Dorn's Life poll. And he was one of the few, I think there were only 2 or 3 national polls that predicted that Trump would win. And Schnur was one of the ones that did it. And after that, we talked about the First Amendment. We had a colloquium on that, driverless cars, evidence-based medicine, and another one of your colleagues, Mr. Newton, Kenneth Turan, talked to us about what's happening in movies. And now we get to this one. I just wanted to thank a few people before I get on with this. I wanted to thank Jan Moulton, our president, and Nancy Bott for the guidance and help along the way, and Nancy is our incoming president. Then we have my committee members, Jim Adler. Jim, I know you're out there somewhere. Oh, there he is. There's Jim. Couldn't have done it without Jim. He has the biggest Rolodex of anybody I know. And then we have Richard Goldman. You're out here. Yep. Thank you, Richard. Then we have something that was very personal to me, my poster evaluation committee, Carolyn Baumwell and Peter McDonough. I know you guys are here somewhere. They're stand up, Carolyn. That was my poster evaluation. Couldn't have done it without. And we have Dick Heiser, my graphics and posters, and Dick's in the back. And then finally, I'm going to call this my layered graphic expert, because as you know, in the middle of the year, we switched to layered graphic posters like the one outside. And I couldn't have done this on my own. This is my son, Eric, who's in the back over here. Eric, stand up. He's my graphic go-to guy. Then we have our videographer, Bill Clarkson. Bill is over here, a very modest man. You should know that Bill has very expensive video equipment, and he's been using it this whole time. I tried to get him a new Plato camera and equipment, and he turned it down. So when you see Bill, you should give him a big thank you, because he is a wonderful guy. He devotes his time. He edits this stuff. He puts it on YouTube. An amazing man. And then we have Sandra Zaitzu. I know she's here somewhere. Where, Sandra? Well, she was supposed to be here. She's our office manager. All right. I wanted to start with the Time covers. The one from 1966 is God Dead and is Truth Dead, which is just this last April. And as you could see, there's a media clash with Donald Trump has led to the Time magazine's homage here of its famous 1966 red on black cover. As a trend-spotting compliment to Time magazine, in 1966, Pew Research said 97% of Americans believed in God. And now here we are today, according to Pew Research, only 63% of Americans believe in God. So that's a big predicting compliment to Time. But on the other hand, unlike Professor Schnur, according to Time magazine, Hillary Clinton is our president. So much for predictability. Why I put that on there is that all of this amounts to a statement about journalism today. Has the press gone away from its traditional job, or just telling readers what's in the news? Does the press have a new self-appointed role of advising readers how they should feel about the news? So, moving on. I sent out a email with a survey in it that you could take that would give your political quotient score. Did anybody look at that email? Did anybody take the 10 questions? All right, well then you know where you fall on this chart. And this is the chart that Professor Glenn Close made when he was at UCLA. And you could see that most of the media is at the top. Oh, by the way, this does not count the editorial pages. These are the news pages. And what was amazing to me is Wall Street Journal is up at the top. That would be the most liberal, and the most conservative toward the bottom. And you'll see that most of the population is over here in the middle, the yellow area. That's where the U.S. average person is, and you'll see that the news media is over that. So I just wanted you to see where you would fall on that chart. And then we'll turn to Gallup, and here's more Americans believe media favors Democrats than Republicans. You'll see that trend line. And then finally, Americans say media favors one political party over the other. And again, that's from Gallup. And then finally, my favorite chart, kind of depressing, really. The blue line at the top is the number of people employed in newspaper publishing starting in 2001, and you'll see that it was over 400,000 people. Now it's under 200,000 people. And the other publishers are more about the same, but you'll see how that has led to a big decline. Today, newspaper publishing is a much smaller group of people. The Los Angeles Times right now has about 430 people working in its newsroom, and Mr. Newton tells me that it was about 1,200 people when he started, so it's down about 2/3 from 1990. We've lost, since this chart started, we've lost 126 daily papers between 2004 and 2014. LA Times is still the 5th largest editorial staff behind the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, New York Times, and the Washington Post. Turning to Jim Newton. Jim Newton was born in Palo Alto. He's a native Californian. He attended Dartmouth College, where he majored in government and graduated with high honors in 1985. Newton is also the quintessential newspaperman. Following graduation, Newton clerked for James Reston, senior columnist for the New York Times. You might remember Mr. Reston as being on the master list of President Nixon's political opponents. That's quite a start, Jim, with there. All right, Newton left the New York Times foreign desk and became a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where he was responsible for coverage of Mayor Andrew Young and the Atlanta City Hall. He met leading members of the civil rights movement. In 1989, he left Atlanta and came to work for the Los Angeles Times. He spent much of the next 2 decades at the center of the state's recent history. He had many titles at the Times, including columnist, reporter, bureau chief, editor of the editorial pages, and editor at large. He covered federal law enforcement and the Los Angeles Police Department from 1992 to 1997, a period that included the 1992 riots, the federal trial of LAPD officers who beat Rodney King, the murder trial of O.J. Simpson. He was the paper's lead reporter for reporting on the Mayor Richard Riordan. By 2007, the Times reported daily circulation of about 600,000 had been cut down by 50% from its peak of 1.2 million in 1990. By 2007, Mr. Newton, or Professor Newton, was the editor of the editorial pages. The Times was going through a difficult period of ownership changes and downsizing its staff. At this critical time, Newton participated in a chat session with Times readers. One of the readers made an observation that made me laugh. When he said, to paraphrase Dorothy Parker, the paper's opinion pieces run the gamut from A to B. But Mr. Newton handled this very tactfully. He responded to such criticism this way, quote, "Morale has frankly been better. What with the changes in ownership and buyouts and uncertainty about the future, that said, this is a professional place and one that's been through an awful lot in my 17 years. We'll get through this." Unquote. Los Angeles County is a very large, immense geographic area where there are thousands of communities, large tract developments stretching for miles in all directions, many hometowns. Yet there are few institutions that hold us all together. That's why Jim Newton was important to the Los Angeles Times and our community. Newton reminds me of the best part of what the Times used to be. He could write his columns in clear, strong language. His reporting explained the ties that both bind and separate our communities. Here's an example of what he wrote about the delivery of water to our own part of Los Angeles. Quote, "The system's brilliance is that a snowflake can fall in the Sierra, trickle down the western slope, drift through the Bay Delta, and into the state water system, and then travel hundreds of miles over mountains to Southern California. That system's delicacy was on display this month when that melted snowflake burst through a broken water main on Sunset Boulevard and ended up in a flood at UCLA." Unquote. Good job, Jim. That was. In 2003, Newton took a leave of absence from the Times to complete work on his biography of Earl Warren, three-term governor of California and Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. In 2011, Newton authored a presidential biography of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Newton's third book, called Worthy Fights, he co-authored with Leon Panetta, former Defense Secretary and CIA Chief. Newton is married to Carlene Goller, former Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for the LA Times. Both Newtons retired from the Times in 2013. They live in Pasadena. Today, Professor Newton is UCLA's favorite communication/journalism professor. He teaches a course in journalistic ethics where he tells his students that the first duty of a journalist is to cover and report news and report the truth. The YouTube video of Professor's ethics classes shows Newton explaining to his students that Los Angeles really was, quote, "a messed up place in the 1990s, but today our police department is more professional," unquote, an achievement for which he argues is in large part owed to the press with a mandate to hold LAPD accountable. As a Superior Court judge for 32 years, I was surprised when listening to Professor Newton explain to his students that journalistic bias was akin to being on jury duty. See, Jim, you fell into my jurisdiction there. So I wasn't laughing. I wanted to see where we were going. So he spoke with such sincerity, that's why I'm going to quote this in full, what he said to his class. Quote, "That never having been a victim of a crime is not a requirement for jury duty. You can take whatever experience you bring to the jury room and set it aside and be fair anyway. That is what I would like to suggest as an analogy to what we are striving for in journalism. We are not asking that we come with no real experience to the business of journalism. That's unreasonable and in fact wouldn't be helpful. It's valuable to put people of different experience to journalism, but what we're asking is that when we go out and work as a journalist, that you find a way to set those biases aside or in the instances where we can't, you will speak up to an editor or let someone know so that you are not put in a position of reflecting your bias to the public. So today, as sort of a backdrop, I want to talk about the general issue of fairness, your two sub-ideas within the notice of fairness. One is the question of objectivity, and the other question is a question of decency, end quote. I will finish by quoting from the remarks of former LA Times columnist and editor Bill Boyarsky on the question of Jim Newton's retirement of the Times. Newton explained vast and too often dysfunctional systems that serve all of Los Angeles County. He was able to write with such authority because he had covered it all as a reporter, ranging from the criminal courts and police to the well-off and privileged in Brentwood. As a columnist, he continued this kind of reporting, traveling through the region to interview people, finding out about their hopes and fears, accomplishments and failings. The Times covers local politics and government, often with fine reporting, but there is not enough of it. Cutbacks, layoffs, and forced retirements have drastically cut the staff and sapped morale. And the diminished staff doesn't have enough veterans. Much of the work falls on inexperienced reporters who haven't built a connection to the communities they cover. Stories of local government and politics have a hard time winning a spot in this competitive and confused news marketplace, but it can be done. All you need are reporters with skill, curiosity, and the ability to tell a story, and editors who stand behind them. Newton was that kind of a reporter, an example to young reporters who might be considering a career path that starts at City Hall. When those bosses let him leave, it was a sign that they don't consider City Hall or other halls of government important or interesting. It also showed they don't understand the Times' role in bringing together this complex region and expanding it to its readers, end quote. Okay, Jim, you're up.
Wow, well that was quite an introduction, thank you. If we could have a recording of that, I'll just play it to put myself to sleep at night. Thank you very much. If you would turn this off, I would really appreciate it. This is making me depressed. Oh, sorry, yeah, does that happen here? I know most of those 200,000 people. Thank you. I'd love to take questions and talk in the Q&A part of this about the state of the newspaper industry and about newspaper bias generally. I really came here today to talk about something more specific, although I think it will impact that conversation, which is I'd really like to talk about Trump. If for no other reason than I can't think of anything, I don't pay attention to anything else anymore. So first of all, though, let me start by saying thank you. Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. Thank you all for being here and for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, even though as I say, I'm here to discuss one of the bleaker aspects of our national life today, which is specifically my topic for the moment is our president and his evolving, complicated, and I think fundamentally poisonous relationship with the national media. As I say, in the aftermath of this, when I'm done, I'd be delighted to talk about, well, I'd say I'm delighted to talk about the LA Times. It's probably an exaggeration, but I'm happy to. But for the moment, though, before I dive in, let me just say that I believe this question of Trump's relationship with the media will be a crucial aspect of his presidency going forward, if it goes forward. It may not, as you all know. Every day, and as many of you seem to hope, every day, it seems like every hour. I mean, I was actually working on the remarks at about 11:30 last night, and I thought if I close the computer, something else will happen. There's something new, really, almost literally every day about Trump or the campaign or connections to Russia or a relationship with the FBI. Lately, I think that's been clearly been compounded by the disclosure that the president may have apparently, or may have, and may have intentionally given classified or priorly classified information to the representatives of the Russian government. All of that may soon overtake this presidency, and if that happens, much of what I say today may seem kind of passé. For the moment, though, I think it remains important, and I think his relationship with the press is important to look at because it's also indicative of other aspects of the presidency, as well as shedding some light on the press and questions of bias. Let me start by saying there's a few aspects of this phenomenon where it's tempting to think that everything is brand new in Washington. Some aspects of this phenomenon, though, are really quite familiar. Presidents from Lyndon Johnson to Barack Obama, especially Richard Nixon, complained about coverage, even as they worked to try to manipulate that coverage and steer it in their favor. But I do think that while these are not, therefore, unique times, they are different, both by degree and qualitatively. I think it is safe to say that the historic institutions and relationships that have protected Americans for generations are now at least in flux, with the potential for great change, but also for some genuinely grave danger. For the purposes today of describing and analyzing Trump's relationship with the media and its implications for society generally, I thought I'd break this down into three areas: his constitutional complaints, his treatment of the press, and for lack of a better word, his lying. Those carry varying degrees of institutional significance and for potential for damage, and they also, I would concede, overlap a bit, but it seemed useful to me, at least organizationally, to lay them out and to do so in that order. So let me just take them one at a time. First, Trump's complaints about the Constitution and its protection of the press. Trump has one very often repeated and apparently sincerely held complaint about the powers of the press under the Constitution. He believes that libel rules, which were established by the United States Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren in the 1960s, and which have been refined in the decades since, give journalists too much protection from lawsuits. That it ought to be easier, in other words, for plaintiffs, specifically public figures, specifically him, to successfully sue news organizations for libel. Time and again, he has pledged to what he says is to loosen or to quote unquote open up libel laws. I'll read to you from a speech he gave about a year ago on this subject, or a passage on this subject. He said, "One of the things I'm going to do if I win, and I hope we do, and we're certainly leading, I'm going to open up our libel laws so that when they purposely write negative and horrible and false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money. We're going to open up those libel laws. So when the New York Times writes a hit piece, which is a total disgrace, or when the Washington Post, which is there for other reasons, I don't know what that means, writes a hit piece, we can sue them and sue them and win money instead of having no chance of winning because they're totally protected." There's good news and bad news, I would say, in that statement. The bad news is that it would be bad, in my view, and even dangerous, if American libel laws were changed in the way that Trump seems to propose. It would stifle discourse and discourage assertive journalism, and in my view, all of that would be to the bad. The good news is that Trump has virtually no opportunity to follow through on that promise. What are the laws that Trump would change if he could with respect to the press? Most American libel law, modern American libel law anyway, derives from a case known as New York Times versus Sullivan. I know there are several judges here in the audience, and of course you'll know it. It was handed down by the Warren Court in 1964. And it held, New York Times versus Sullivan, its essential holding is that to prevail in a libel suit, a public official must show that any contested statement in the story was about that official, that it damaged his or her reputation, and that it was made with what the court referred to as actual malice. Essentially meaning that the publisher either knew that the statement was false or recklessly published the statement with reason to believe that it was false and did so anyway. The initial case involved a police, I won't go into the whole history of New York Times versus Sullivan, we can talk about it more if you want to later, but the initial case involved a police commissioner in Alabama, and it applied, as I said a moment ago, to public officials, quote unquote, in the conduct of their official work. But New York Times versus Sullivan has been steadily expanded over the years to cover all public figures. That most certainly includes candidates for public office. The actual malice standard in New York Times versus Sullivan is deliberate. It's by design, it makes it difficult for public figures to recover damages from news organizations, even news organizations that make mistakes. And there's a good reason for that. Sullivan is a model, in my view, not just of First Amendment law, but also of common sense. And that's because as a society, we want reporters to look hard at public figures, especially those who affect our legal and cultural standards. We want to know if we can trust a politician or whether we should follow the model of a celebrity. Therefore, we want our laws to support an assertive press and protect reporters who are doing their best but make an innocent error. At the same time, we are a society that values privacy. And we understandably flinch at the idea of reporters making up stories and using them to harm people, especially people who are not seeking any kind of public attention. Sullivan intentionally gives those people greater protection under the law. It allows them to recover damages if the press is merely negligent in reporting about them, not that the press be forced to be shown to have acted with actual malice. Sullivan then represents an attempt to reconcile two strong but competing impulses in American life: the desire to hold public figures accountable, while offering some protection for the privacy of private individuals, people outside the limelight. It is precisely because Sullivan balances and thoughtfully balances those interests that it has endured and been expanded over time, with support from both conservatives and liberals. Trump, however, does not share the conviction that those ideas are in proper balance. He would prefer a system that makes it much easier for public officials, including him, to sue news organizations and win. The question then is, could Trump change that standard? The answer is, at least in theory, yes. He could propose a constitutional amendment that would void Sullivan and substitute some new standard. To get that, he would need the support of 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and it would require the ratification of 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's 38 out of 50 states. Interestingly, by the way, as an aside, really the only person in the American political process who has nothing to do with the constitutional amendment is the president himself. His approval is not required for a constitutional amendment. So with or without him, though, we're talking about a process that requires extraordinarily broad consensus. 38 out of 50 states is hard to imagine. Just by way of example, the last serious attempt at a constitutional amendment was the Equal Rights Amendment, which fell short of ratification for proposing the radical notion that women should not be discriminated against in the Constitution. These days, we have a Congress that can't even muster a majority without great struggle to overturn a health care bill that they spent 7 years saying they wanted to repeal. The idea that 2/3 of the members of either House of Congress could get together behind an upheaval in First Amendment law is hard to believe. Never mind 3/4 of the states. There is an alternative. There's another way that the Constitution could be changed with respect to libel law, and that's that the court itself, of course, could overturn Sullivan. It always has the right to do so. But I must say that seems equally unlikely. Sullivan has been settled law now for more than 50 years in the United States, and the court's only efforts to tinker with Sullivan have been to extend its range, as I said, from public officials to public figures, and to reaffirm its central finding. I am not aware of a single justice on the court today, much less 5, who would be prepared to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan. So, in short, Trump's disgust with libel laws in this country may run deep, it does appear to, but his capacity to affect those laws is shallow indeed. So I would sort of sum up here as saying no great threat there to the press from Trump and his proposals. Let me move from that to what I would call marginalization of the press under Trump. This is a more informal aspect of his relationship. This doesn't involve constitutional amendments or changes in the law. But he does seem to harbor a fairly visceral hatred of the leading press institutions in this country. Let me say, by way of clarity, presidents are not required to like the press. Very few do. There's been a range of relationships. I mentioned a couple before, but presidents from Thomas Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln to Dwight Eisenhower to Richard Nixon and Barack Obama even have complained about the quality of coverage. Barack Obama was known for aggressively pursuing leaks in his administration. More journalists jailed under President Obama than all previous presidents combined. So this is not a partisan issue either. Still, I do think this is different. Where Trump has differed, I think, from his predecessors is that he and his inner circle have not just criticized the press, but have really demonized and marginalized it to a degree that is unique to this administration. Trump himself has accused the New York Times, Washington Post, and others of propagating what he calls fake news, including those organizations' attempts to cover the web of allegations concerning Russian involvement in the 2016 election. During the campaign, Trump restricted his traveling press to a small pen during his rallies, and he encouraged his supporters to turn on the press and join him in denouncing individual reporters and their employers. He mocked a reporter with a disability, dismissed critical reports as false and malicious, and as president famously accused the press of being, quote unquote, the enemy of the people. Most recently, after his aides delivered a series of explanations for his firing of FBI Director Jim Comey that he himself then promptly contradicted, Trump has suggested that he's considering canceling the traditional White House daily briefing. Just yesterday, and this is why I was up last night, continuing to amend these, he complained that no politician in history has ever been more treated unfairly than himself. All of which is at least a little bit surprising given Trump's relationship with the press prior to his presidency. As a New York real estate developer and CEO, he courted publicity, seemed to covet attention from the press. He was frequently featured in New York gossip columns, and at one point even posed as his own spokesperson in order to plant stories about himself in the news. You still see some hint of that of that Trump, by the way, the sort of the eager, desperate to be pleased, infatuated with coverage, and yet also very wounded by it. It all has a sort of 8-year-old quality to it, of which you see a lot, I think, in this relationship. What's undisputed is that he has waged a rhetorical war against his media critics, both real and perceived, not just disagreeing with them, but attempting to dismiss them altogether. The important question, I think, in this category here is why. My guess, I don't have insight into him really personally, but my guess is that it's a calculated attempt to protect himself from criticism, combined with an impulsive refusal to accept his imperfections as reported by the press. Whatever the cause, though, the result really does have serious implications. Historically, there are relatively few checks on the power of a president. All of you from your civics growing up know this. Congress is meant to be the principal check and balance, as we say, on the president. And in some respects, this Congress, even though both houses are controlled by Republicans, has acted as a brake on President Trump. Notably, for instance, the House refused initially to approve his repeal of the Affordable Care Act, mostly because constituents were so offended by it. It ultimately did by a very narrow margin, and now we'll see what the Senate does with it. But for the most part, Congress has been fairly much sidelined under Trump. It's yet to take up his budget proposal, which isn't really a proposal so far, which is why they haven't taken it up. But there hasn't been a lot asked of Congress by Trump. In fact, his major actions and attempted actions have mostly come by executive order or by his oversight of the military, neither of which involve Congress at least directly. On immigration, he's acted by executive order, and in conflicts in Syria and North Korea, he's acted through his generals, again, largely free of congressional oversight. Congress has stood by uneasily, as you all know, in the recent days as the Russian allegations have unfolded, unsure how close, in the case of the Republican leadership, unsure how close to ally themselves with a leader who appears to many people in Washington anyway to be increasingly unstable and certainly undeniably unpredictable. The courts, meanwhile, another source of check and balance in our system, have given Trump a somewhat harder time than Congress. A Republican judge in Seattle blocked Trump's first attempt at a travel and immigration ban from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. Trump responded by denigrating him as a, quote, so-called judge. A Democratic judge from Hawaii blocked the second iteration of that same travel order. Attorney General Sessions wondered aloud how a judge, quote, from an island in the Pacific could be allowed to dictate American immigration policy. At the highest levels, though, the judiciary today is just as solidly Republican as Congress, or the presidency for that matter. With the addition of Justice Gorsuch, the United States Supreme Court maintains its longstanding majority of conservative justices, and they seem unlikely to be a consistent firewall between Trump and individual rights. So what does that leave in terms of institutional checks on the president's authority? Essentially, that leaves the media. Let me be clear. I'm not arguing that the president needs to be nice to reporters or treat them with kid gloves or that reporters can't take criticism. Reporters deserve to be held accountable like everyone else in the system. The byline is a great way of doing that. But Trump's criticisms don't question so much the accuracy of the media, but rather its legitimacy. If the New York Times offers up fake news, as he says, then surely its efforts to present the story from Washington should be ignored by regular people. Trump's reaction to media is no different qualitatively from the administration's reactions to the judges who've challenged it, is to dismiss both. That, I would submit, is dangerous, but not only dangerous to the Republic in terms of this larger sense of checks and balances, but actually damaging to Trump himself and the goals of his administration. So let me, in that vein, let me just diverge for 1 second to talk about Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, obviously. Tillerson has his own form of belittling and sidelining media, and that's just to do not engage with them at all. When he traveled to Asia recently, he turned down the traditional press pool that accompanies the Secretary of State overseas and instead invited a single conservative reporter to accompany him. When he met with Putin 2 months ago in Moscow, the press corps the American press corps, the Western press corps in Moscow was not alerted to the meeting, so all of the reports of that meeting initially came from Russian media. When the Russian ambassador and foreign minister paid a visit to Trump at the request of Vladimir Putin the day after he had fired Comey, the only media allowed in the Oval Office was Russian media. So you had the result, I guess, I would argue, it certainly, unquestionably hampers American media. So this may sound like just sort of pleading for special treatment, but it also has the effect, I think, unwittingly, of constraining Tillerson's influence as well. Rather than using his position to advance arguments for why the world should, for instance, recoil at Russian involvement in Syria, Tillerson allows Putin's state media to set that agenda. The result is weird. I mean, American news organizations, you have the striking fact, if you look at CNN today, I'm sure if they show pictures of that White House meeting, it is actually credited to the Russian Foreign Ministry at a meeting in the Oval Office. And it's obviously, of course, irritating for news organizations to have to do that. But less often commented on, or less commented on generally, is that those same results are devastating to Trump's foreign policy goals. He's not in control of them because he is not using the media, he and Tillerson are not using the media as a vehicle to explain American policy. So my final section here, let me talk about Trump as a liar. There's a saying in newspapers that newspapers should not exist to be an attack dog or to be a lapdog, but rather to be a watchdog. That's a lot of dogs, but you get my point. One aspect of doing that, of trying to do that correctly, has been the duty that journalists have taken upon themselves to hold public officials accountable for the truthfulness of their remarks and positions. And that role has placed the media consistently in conflict with Trump, first as a candidate and then as president. I'll just toss off a few examples here. First, Trump came to political prominence as the chief arguer in favor of the position that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. That's a lie. Obama was born in Hawaii, as verified by his birth announcement in a Honolulu newspaper, his short-form birth certificate, his long. I don't know how many of you have all this information, but I don't know. I couldn't produce all this about myself. During the campaign, Trump abruptly reversed on that position and announced that Obama was in fact born in the United States, but he's never acknowledged his role in having spread that lie in the first place. By the way, and this is just a point of personal interest, Ted Cruz was born in Canada, Mitt Romney's father, who ran for president, was born in Mexico, and John McCain was born in the Canal Zone. You don't hear much about those, but another question for another day. Back to Trump. Trump opened his presidential campaign by asserting that Mexico, quote unquote, sends us, end quote, its rapists and other criminals. There is no evidence to suggest that's true. He has alleged that climate change is fake, was invented by China to secure economic advantage of the United States. There is no credible scientist on earth who agrees with that statement. On March 16th, Trump said the New York Times wrote about Obama having wiretapped him during the election. It did not. On February 8th, Trump said, quote, the murder rate in the United States has never been higher. That's false. In fact, it's near an all-time low. On February 6th, Trump said that 109 people had been affected by his immigration order. In fact, it's roughly 60,000 people, which is hardly a rounding error. On December 16th of last year, Trump said he won a, quote, massive landslide victory in the Electoral College, maps of which he has now in his office. In fact, it was one of the 25% most narrow victories in American history. Trump repeatedly has asserted that widespread voter fraud denied him a victory in the popular vote, and he's announced a commission to look into this. He's the only president I've ever heard of who announced a commission to analyze an election that he won. But there is no evidence whatsoever of any such widespread fraud. He also has added, just to gild that 14% of non-citizens are registered to vote. That is not true. I could obviously go on. I borrowed these from a list that Politico has its website, on its website. Its list of false statements is somewhere just above 100, and it goes on for 7 pages. It's also hard to believe that we've heard the last of those. What does that do, though, back to my original point, what does that do to Trump's relationship with the media? It poisons it. Every time Trump lies and the press points it out, it becomes another source of conflict, of derision, and debasement. And this war goes on, and increasingly it becomes self-fulfilling, that Trump views the press as an adversary, lies about it, that Trump acts as an adversary, and so on, and we go and go. So what are we supposed to do about this? First of all, let's stipulate that the relationship is bad and it's not likely to improve anytime soon. I would further stipulate that Trump seems unlikely to change his ways, so is it incumbent on the press to do something to manage this? Here is what I would say is the temptation that the media needs to resist. It is too easy to take offense at all of this and rise to the bait. I know a lot of reporters, and many of them in Washington, and some of them are really mortally offended by Trump and feel it's their obligation to act as sort of a counterweight to an administration that they worry is coming unhinged. That, in my view, would be a mistake. It would tend to validate Trump's notion that the presidency and the press are inherently adversarial and reinforce his conviction, especially the conviction among his strong supporters, that the press isn't to be trusted. What I would argue for will probably be exasperated, I know it is to some of my colleagues in Washington, but it's for something as simple as patience. In the end, Trump needs the press more than the press needs Trump. More importantly, America needs the press more than it needs Trump, and it may be about to discover that. The American press pre-existed the American Republic and has been a defining feature of this country's power structure from the very beginning. It is, as sometimes noted, the only business that is specifically mentioned in the United States Constitution. Long after Trump is back in reality TV, the press in Washington will be there. And its obligations will be the same, not to boost up presidents or to tear them down. Rather, I think the press's duty, unaffected by whoever the occupant of the White House of the moment is to hold officials accountable without fear or favor in the abiding hope that the American public will come around and that the truth ultimately will prevail. There really is no other option, as far as I can tell. We can only try and hope. And with that, I will conclude what I had to say here and invite you to ask questions. I thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to go to our question and answer period, and as usual, I'll ask you to keep personal questions out of this and your personal stories and just go straight to questions. And we have someone on either side here that with the microphone, and you could take the microphone and ask away to Professor Newton. So see who, we already have someone standing. Go ahead.
Please, thank you.
It seems to me that there are really two types of press. There's the press that is on one side of the argument, and there's Fox News on the other. And that there are a hardcore of people who get their news from Fox News or the alternative. How do you deal with that?
Well, good question. I think it's a little more complicated than that, although I get your point. I mean, The existence of partisan or ideologically based journalism is really nothing new in American politics. In fact, it's something very old. There's a whole sort of history of the press that I won't bore you with today, but this notion of sort of centralizing objective institutions in the press is really a kind of World War II and beyond phenomenon, and the professionalization of the press. So I don't think that this is a roundabout way of me saying, I don't think that there's anything wrong with ideological press. I think where it's complicated and where I think it's perilous today is that people are using it to substitute for any kind of objective press rather than to supplement it. Again, this will sound digressive, but just quickly, I've done 2 books now that are based largely in the 1950s. And one of the things you really see in that period is a kind of common agreement on the facts of an argument. The New York Times famously used to run transcripts of major events. In fact, during the McCarthy hearings, the New York Times ran a daily transcript of the McCarthy hearings for months. It went on 8 or 10 pages. And one real benefit of that, I think, is you could read an analysis piece in the New York Times. You could agree or disagree with it, but you could very quickly refer to the underlying material and decide whether you thought the New York Times had done a fair job of it. And the result is that kind of, instead of arguing over the facts of questions, we argued over the ramifications, and I say Americans, argued much more forcefully over the ramifications. If we agreed as a society largely that the Soviet Union posed a threat, nuclear and ideological, to the United States, which most of mainstream politics did at that time, the question and the argument became what to do about that, as opposed to whether that was true. Now I do think, and Fox News and I think MSNBC on the other side are guilty of this, or at least are taking advantage of this notion that I think people are seeking affirmation for their views rather than exploring challenges to those views. And it's one thing to do that if we're talking about agreement on policy matters or disagreement on policy matters. It's another if we're talking about disagreement about what actually happened in the world. And that's, I'm afraid, where we are, and I don't think either Fox or MSNBC will cure that problem. My only real hope for it, just to be an optimist on it, is that people will come to crave that or continue to crave it and sort of re-up their enthusiasm for information that doesn't come at you with a slant. Unfortunately, I think that the president is not doing any favors to that debate. There is a difference, and this is often a different point a little bit, but there is a difference between a journalist who makes a mistake in a story and a journalist who sets out to write something that is fake, that is false. One, to my view, the latter is what I would call fake news. Stories that are utterly made up. The story that Barack Obama repealed the National Pledge of Allegiance. This was a big story, I don't know, a couple of years ago. It's ridiculous. That he was born not in the United States. These are stories that are false and intended to be false. A Time magazine reporter made a mistake early in the administration and said that Trump had removed the bust of Martin Luther King from his office. In fact, a security person was standing in such a way that the reporter didn't see it. That's a stupid mistake, and he should be apologetic for it, and he is. But he didn't say, that's not an example of fake news. That's an example of a legitimate reporter making a mistake. And I think the American public has got to become more sophisticated at distinguishing between the two of those. Unfortunately, Trump is not helping in that process. So that's a roundabout way of answering. I hope I answered your question somewhere in the middle of that. Please, yeah.
I wanted to get back to your last point you were making in your talk, where you were talking about your colleagues and how they're handling it and how they're reacting to you. I'd like to elaborate on that. But one of the points that I talk about, what I think has happened is Trump is a name caller. He labels everything. And I think he set the ground rules because a lot of the press is doing the same thing he's doing, and so you don't get anywhere. So what do you think?
Yeah, listen, I mean, I think it's, at some level, these are people, right? And there is a tendency to sort of lash back when criticized. And I think reporters, that's clearly in the part of this president's kind of DNA, is he's very reactive. And as you say, sort of a name caller. If you cross him, you're in trouble, and he make you pay for it. Now, sometimes he invites those people back, but that's kind of a longer process. I think it's incumbent on the press not to give in to that. I mean, I mean, listen, I can't even begin to tell you the email I used to get as a columnist for the paper. I can't, if there's a name, a derogatory name that's been invented that I have not been called, I don't know what it is. And some of that just has to go with the bargain. I mean, I think that is what reporters need to just absorb that. On a human level, I'm sympathetic. It's hard to, I mean, I don't know him well, but I do happen to know the reporter from the disabled reporter from the New York Times who was made fun of by Trump. It's hard to not take that personally and want to get even in some way. But that's not the job that we do. And I think I mean, when I say we, I mean reporters. And so I do think in the long term, the interests of the press and individual reporters will be served by not rising to that. But it's hard, you know, and I don't envy anyone who has to be in the middle. The only people in the less enviable position, in my view, are those who have to speak for Trump and are sort of in this constant position of saying it and then unsaying it and then re-saying it and then being, you know, I don't feel that sorry for them. They made a choice, but they're in some ways the most difficult situation in this whole kind of environment because they don't get to really even speak for themselves. But I do think reporters have a special obligation and all of that, and that's really to hold their fire. And I think for the most part, people are doing that. But I think you're right that to some extent there is a sense that you come after us, we got power too, and that's not to be desired. Yes, ma'am.
Usually that press is responsible for increasing the notoriety of Trump during the primary process to raise him to a higher level of notice by all aspects of society.
Yeah, it's a very good, well, I hope you all heard the question. It's a good one and a hard one to answer. I think there is a period there where Trump probably got more attention than press would normally give to a candidate of sort of limited stature, in the sense that he was, you know, no experience in politics, he'd raised no money, I mean, it was all his own money. And it's in that very early period of his campaign that he, I think, struck many people as a novelty and may have been covered more as a novelty than as a serious candidate. There's an invisible moment, and therefore hard to pin down moment, where he turned from being that novelty to being something quite serious. And yes, I think a lot of people in the press kind of missed that shift. I would also only add, slightly in our defense, the people who really missed that shift were his opponents in the Republican primary process. And they all shared a conviction, which is that he would burn out, and that why then in the meantime risk antagonizing his supporters by attacking him. For one thing, he's very effective on the rebound, and so they didn't like the idea of tangling with him personally, but also some, you know, between 18 and 25% of the electorate throughout that process was fairly steadfast with him. So why alienate those people if he's going to go away anyway? Well, then he didn't go away, and now you have to live with what the consequence was. That's not a media problem, I don't think. I mean, the media is sort of complicit in it and a participant in it, but ultimately that's a factor of how he ran and the particulars of this campaign. If this campaign had been Trump versus, you know, first of all, I should say, I thought Rubio would win, so what do I know? But if this had been Trump-Rubio from the beginning, say, I don't think Trump would be president. I mean, I don't love the idea that Rubio would have been either, but he benefited by the fact that there was a very large field and he had a small but dedicated piece of that electorate. And the other Republicans made a calculation that they would not risk antagonizing that electorate and therefore let him off and not challenge him until it turned out to be too late. Well, that's a political calculation. It turned out to be the wrong one, but it wasn't an unreasonable one. I mean, it was a strategy. And as I say, I think media has some to answer for there, particularly in the very early stages of the campaign. But once he starts winning primaries, once he becomes a legitimate frontrunner, certainly once he becomes a nominee, and moreover, once he becomes president, I mean, there's no ignoring him just because some of us may feel he's got a sort of carnival aspect to him. There's no ignoring him once he's crossed certain political thresholds that make him, by definition, not only a serious candidate, but the frontrunner, which once he crossed that threshold, he was it throughout. So I think the band of media malfeasance or oversight is fairly small and right at the beginning of the campaign. Once it took off, I don't think there's much else that people could have done. I'm sorry, let me add one last thing and I'll stop. I would remind you that every negative thing that you know about him, from, talking about assaulting women to insulting a Mexican-American judge to the Gold Star family, you name it, is something that was reported by the press. So it's not that he got an easy ride. I think you're right to point out that the bigger question is whether he got an early kind of infatuated ride. And I think that, to some degree, I think you're right about that, but I think it was fairly small.
I wanted to ask you about the libel laws. As you pointed out, there are three factors. It has to be wrong, they have to have known it was wrong when they published it, and there has to be malice. Well, I don't understand the difference between knowing that it's wrong and malice. Would you explain that?
And malice?
Yes.
Yeah. Malice, as used in Sullivan, is not the way we would use it in everyday parlance. In fact, it is defined as two things: either knowingly publishing something that's false or recklessly publishing something, believing that it might be false. That is, for the purposes of Sullivan, that is the definition of malice, which is not really an English definition so much as a legal definition. But the point then being is that the idea of recklessness is incorporated within the notion of malice. The important thing that Sullivan does is it requires that public officials, now public figures, meet that standard. Now, I teach an ethics course, as was mentioned kindly in the introduction. At UCLA, we talk a lot about this. There's a lot of implications of that. It's not all of them positive for the press. One problem being that now, because a public figure is required to show evidence of malice in order to win a lawsuit, that means that person's entitled to inquire into malice. So a reporter's notes, a reporter's conversations with people outside the paper, the editing process, all of that becomes subject to discovery. It becomes very complicated, very expensive. So Sullivan is not altogether good for the press. There are certain things that it makes much more difficult in a newsroom environment. But in general, what it's intended to do is protect the press from being successfully sued for a non-malicious error. The case that it grows out of, the Sullivan itself, Sullivan, as I mentioned, is a police commissioner from Alabama. It actually was an ad that appeared in the New York Times, not a story. And the ad was taken out by defenders of Martin Luther King who were trying to raise money for him. And the ad had errors in it. It said that students had been arrested while they were singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and in fact they were singing My Country 'Tis of Thee or something. It said that they had been arrested at the state capitol when they'd in fact been arrested at a lunch counter protest. I mean, they were errors, but they weren't material errors, and they were not made maliciously. So what the court decided in Sullivan, somewhat provocatively, is it decided to impose this new standard that said malice, and then it applied it, rather than sending it back to the courts for rehearing, where they knew the New York Times would lose again because it would go back to Alabama. They applied the new standard. They articulated the new standard, applied the standard, and dismissed the case. Call it judicial activism. But the result of it was that it got rid of a case that was threatening to civil rights, not just to the New York Times, and it was all done based on this notion of malice, which incorporates recklessness. Does that answer the question?
Pretty much. What I had in mind was the Israeli prime minister, when he was a general, was accused of allowing Christians to come in and massacre Muslims. He sued. I believe it may have been time. They showed that it did not. It was false. He was not responsible. The Times knew that it was false, but they didn't do it with malice, so we lost the libel case.
I'd have to look at that to understand the specifics of how that would, because that does seem to thwart the notion that if you knew it and published it anyway, that it would not be malicious. I don't know the particular facts of it well enough to debate them or even to articulate them. In general, though, that's what would be required to show malice, is some previous knowledge that it was false and a willingness to go forward anyway. This stuff is, obviously, it's complicated and it's very case by case. Melania Trump just had a libel suit herself. And it's a curious one in this regard, too, in that I not know the details perfectly. It's too bad my wife isn't here. This is what she does for a living, but so she could tell you for sure. But don't hold me to this, but in sum and substance, her argument was that there was an American publication that unfortunately also published in England, which has a different standard on these, but an American publication that reported that other publications had written that while she was a model, she also served as part of an escort service. It said, in the American version of this, it said that these reports were believed to be false, but they were nevertheless a distraction for the Trump campaign. She sued anyway, saying that the fact that you say that they're false is evidence that you believe that they're false, and yet you're repeating them. The case ended up settling, so we don't really have a complete sort of litigation of it. But that goes to some of the complexity of this, is can you report something that you know to be false if you're saying in the context of reporting it that it is false and that it has other implications. These things get complicated quickly, and certainly the judges in the audience can back me up on that. But in any case, normally speaking, I would say, as a layman, that proof that something was published that was knowingly false would be a long way, if not all the way, towards showing malice.
Right here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
When Trump lied, what specifically should reporters and editors say?
Yeah, well, the New York Times in this cycle is the first time, I believe ever, certainly to my knowledge anyway, the first time the New York Times has ever referred to someone in a headline as lying. And that has to do with the birth certificate, or where the birthplace issue. That's a fairly big decision for the New York Times to do. I mean, more typically, the New York Times, or the LA Times for that matter, would quote whoever was saying something and then other people disputing it, but would not try to arbitrate that dispute and say that so-and-so is lying and so-and-so is telling the truth. I suspect that represents a fair amount of just fed-upness, of a sense of being lied to or whatever. And by the way, there is just no, I'll step outside myself here for a moment and say I do not understand any explanation other than lying to explain the birther issue. There is such an abundance of proof of where Obama was born. There was an announcement of his birth in a Honolulu newspaper. How they would have backdated that to imagine the day that he would become president and sneak away the fact that he had been born in Kenya is boggling. So I think it is appropriate to call that a lie. Is it appropriate to call every misstatement a lie? No. He makes mistakes, so do we, so does everyone. And so, I think it's incumbent on reporters and editors, if they are utterly persuaded that something is more than just a misstatement of fact, but is in fact an actual calculated lie, I think it's important to call it what it is. I don't know that the reporter's under an obligation to do that in the press conference to him, nose to nose. Sometimes it's hard to know. You have to do research to determine whether something is really true or not. But I certainly think it's the obligation of news organizations to be clear about that. I don't think there's any point in words like falsehood or misstatement, or if in the case of, say, the birther issue, if it is provably the case that he's lying. And by the way, I say that with respect to Trump because he seems to make such a habit of it, but I would argue that for another person in politics too. I mean, if Ted Cruz does this or Barack Obama does it, there's I'm not trying to invent a new Trump standard. I'm just trying to say that if we're going to get to a point where politicians feel comfortable lying, then we should at least alert people to the fact that they are.
It's me next. Sorry. In an age of Twitter jitter like he's got, how do you feel about all this tweeting and the belief by a lot of people that the tweeting is more effective than media? And also the fact that he just recently said that Obama wiretapped him, that went away because every minute there's a new thing that takes its place. How do you feel about that now there's no apology, there's no follow-up, and there are a lot of people who actually believe it because his tweeting has become like a media frenzy for the public, not the actual media?
Yeah. Two things. First of all, I would say presidents have always, not always, but presidents in modern times, since the development of modern media, have always looked for ways to speak directly to people. The fireside chat is kind of the first real big important iteration of that. So that in and of itself I don't think is new or even necessarily objectionable. Presidents have available to them communication skills that the rest of us. I mean, I have a Twitter account. I mean, it's not some special prerogative of the presidency. So in that sense, I don't fault him for trying to reach people directly. If you can speak to people directly and be unmediated by a critical press, well, why not? I think the question for press is complicated in it, which is sort of how to treat these. Are they the acts of a calculating political figure who's trying to change the subject? So on a day that we're talking about his business conflicts of interest and he tweets out a tweet about burning the American flag, are we all supposed to write about burning the American flag today just because the president woke up early and tweeted about it and saw it on Fox and said something? Is that an attempt to change the subject, in which case should journalists hold the line and continue to cover the subject? Or is it the act of an impulsive, sort of immature person who fires off the first thing that comes into his head? In other words, it's not really calculating so much as it is kind of impulsively reactive. If it's the latter, then I think it is important for journalists to cover it, because it's important to realize the kind of person we're dealing with. I mean, this comes up in a more serious way with respect to Jim Comey, right? I mean, in the sense that there's a couple different explanations for getting rid of Comey. One is that he maligned Hillary Clinton. Seems unlikely that that's the one, but that's the one he cited, for the press people cited first, right? Is that he was, the way he handled that investigation was inappropriate and he should be fired for it. 6 months ago, that probably would have held more water than it does today. The next explanation is his, as he says that I had decided that he was unfit for the job, that yes, I got that recommendation, but I decided beforehand to get rid of it. And then there's the third explanation, which is that he just lost his temper, that he was watching this guy on TV. In other words, that it wasn't really calculated, that it wasn't a long plan to get rid of him, but that he watched him testify over the weekend and he felt like this guy just doesn't have his back, and he axed him. Now, the last explanation I don't know if it's the right one or not. I mean, there's versions of each of those explanations. But if the last one is correct, then those tweets are relevant to that, because that shows us that they are illustrative of a character who is impulsive and reactive. Some people love that. And some people are really troubled by it. But if that's the person we're dealing with, then those tweets become part of that larger character story. Journalists are always subject to being manipulated. There's a whole infrastructure in Washington that exists to manipulate the press. To make stories come out. That's what spin is. And so reporters are always supposed to be mindful of it, and I think the tweets are sort of fit within that zone of things that reporters have to be very careful about. But I don't think it's satisfactory to just say, let's just ignore them, because they are real, and millions of people do read them, and they may tell us something kind of fundamental about who he is, and if so, it would be a disservice of journalism to not present that information. So I think they have to be taken kind of one at a time, but I don't think a solution that says report them all as if they were deadly serious or don't report them at all is satisfying. That somehow there has to be judgment applied to each one.
Hello.
We have
I'm
somebody
sorry.
in the back.
Oh, I thought,
Yes, I'm sorry.
okay. My question was along the line of,
He's been waiting.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Sorry, I'm confusing everything. It's my fault, sorry.
Jim, as someone who has spent time in the city room, I was at the LA Times, I have been troubled in the last several years by false equivalence in the reporting of news. Now, when I started back in 1960, my first editor said, make sure you give the opposing side of any story equal treatment. And he used to cite the example of the butcher in his native Milwaukee who claimed his sausage was made with perfect balance, one rabbit, one horse. And so I really am sort of sensitive to when I sense that the other side of an argument is really stretching things. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on false equivalence.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent and incredibly germane concern. Well, here's what I tell my students, if you beg my indulgence, is that balance is important, but it's not a substitute for truth. And there are certain things and back to sort of the earlier point about reliance on a kind of common set of facts. While I was editorial page editor, just to diverge a little bit, we made a decision to stop accepting, I made a decision in conjunction with my colleagues, to to stop accepting any submission to the page that argued that climate change was not real. That in just the same way that we wouldn't accept a submission to the page that said that smoking cigarettes doesn't cause cancer, or that the world is flat, or any other disproven notion. That's that's a little edgier than not accepting pieces that say that tobacco doesn't cause cancer. But it is, in fact, scientifically no longer debated in that community. What is debatable, and what we did continue to accept willingly on the page, is questions about what to do about that. And also even questions about the genesis of it. How much of it is natural versus how much of it is man-made. There are places to argue about climate change. And it is to my mind anyway, a perfectly legitimate argument to say the world is getting warmer, people are at least partly responsible, and yet it's too disruptive for us as a society to react to it, so we're just going to have to learn to live with it. Now, I don't happen to endorse that as a policy matter, but I think that's a legitimate argument for someone to present on an editorial page. And as part of balance, if I were doing a story on climate change, I would include someone who had that view. What I would not include is someone who says the numbers are fabricated, there is no evidence of warming, there's no more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there used to be, all of which is false. The problem, of course, is when do you reach that point? When do you reach the point where you've really decided a matter and you're no longer going to reach out for balance on it? I think journalists should be very conservative about doing that. I mean, I think that we shouldn't make those kinds of decisions. Journalists aren't capable of, really aren't occupationally in the right people to decide whether climate change is real or not. You have to rely on other people to do that. But once that's done, then I think then there no longer is that need to find quote unquote balance. Where there is a need for balance is in the expression of opinions about matters where once the facts are in front of us, we decide what to do about it. There's no dispute fundamentally about the facts of abortion law, for instance, in this country. It is what it is. There's a certain number of abortions performed every year. People disagree about what to call it, et cetera. But people are allowed to have radically different views, and any story about abortion ought to include the pros and cons of it, because people honestly can disagree about it. That's different than disagreeing about facts or science or whatever. And so, to my mind, there's a place for balance and there's a place for truth, and balance should be there to explore our social differences and the way we resolve them, but they shouldn't pretend that things that are true are not true.
Back over here.
May I have this turn? Okay. My question is along with what you were just saying. You were a gatekeeper for the front page or the newspaper.
Right. Well,
right now, we have the problem of direct contact through technology of tweeting. I used to think they wouldn't let Obama have use of his cell phone.
I guarantee you there's some people on Trump who are trying to take it away from him right now.
Right. So I don't understand why he has such free access to use that technology, but I don't understand tweeting that much either. But my question is, comment please on the social media amplification of the lack of factual data in Facebook and all of these other means. There is no jurisprudence anymore if people are not reading the Times, if they're not reading the Post, if they're going only to the social media. Where do you recommend some filters that might help educate people who are operating on non-fact?
It's funny, I was on a panel at the Society for Professional Journalists just last night talking about just this question, a kind of social media literacy and how to encourage it. I don't think that this is fundamentally a job that newspapers can solve for people. I mean, if you're a reader who already believes that the New York Times is an adjunct of the Hillary Clinton campaign and is there solely for the purpose of advancing a kind of leftist agenda, then the fact that the New York Times tells you that it's trying to tell you the truth is not going to really resonate much with you. I mean, I think that you're not reachable by that publication. So I don't. To me, this is more of a consumer problem, frankly, than it is a producer problem, which is not to minimize it as a problem. It's just to say that I'm not sure that media is going to be able to be the solution to it. Here's what I would say more broadly than that, is that yes, social media makes it possible for a lie to whirl around the world in 30 seconds. It also provides us the tools to check it. in a way that didn't exist before. And one thing that I think that newspapers and news organizations generally ought to do more of, and I think are doing more of, is to link to source material. So that if you're reading, I mentioned the transcripts that the New York Times used to run. I think part of the helpfulness of that was that as a reader, you could, if they said McCarthy made an outrageous allegation in the lead of a story on page 1, you could turn to page 8 and decide for yourself whether that was an outrageous allegation. So there was within the context of the four corners of your newspaper, there was the ability to check for yourself and see whether that reporting struck you as accurate. Similarly today, you know, if I saw a story that was attributed to statistics provided by, you know, Bob Smith Statistical Service, I would regard them, and the link was to that, I would regard that differently than if the link was to the United States Census or to a source that I would regard as credible. I do think that literate readers are going to have to get used to doing that. They're going to have to challenge themselves to challenge reporting and to read multiple sources. People who really care, that is. Now, can I make everybody care? Obviously not. And so I don't, you know, some of this is going to require time. This is a new way of reading. This is a new way of understanding news. And I think in the short run, if you call up the front page of you know, a fake news site, it'll look a lot like a regular news site. If someone was on my panel last night was talking about it, I forget what the story was, but it was a story that was reported to be written by ABC. Well, if you looked at the URL, it was abc.com.co, which means, I just learned this last night, so I'm pretending I know more than I do, but apparently what that means is that it originates from Colombia. And so it's some guy in Colombia who's ripped off the ABC webpage and has typed in a story and told you that it's true, and it's all completely bullshit. What do you do to educate yourself about that? Well, I guess you look at the story, you notice that it's all attributed to unnamed sources, or it's attributed to statistics or other information that come from unreliable places, that there's nothing that backs it up, and that when you look at a story in the New York Times or the LA Times or the Washington Post, that there's a different standard that you can perceive, that you yourself are satisfied that it's of different quality of reporting. You know, one of the better things that's happened to media, at least to newspapers, or at least to some newspapers since Trump was elected, is that a lot more people are going to those sources. The New York Times is doing gangbusters. And that's because I think a lot of people are frustrated with it. Not everyone. And I think it'll take us a while as a society to get to a point where we have that kind of level of, generally, that level of sophistication. But it's going to be a person at a time, and I think it's going to, as I say, I think it's going to be more driven by consumers than it is going to be by news organizations.
I'd like to go back to your story about the reporter that reported the missing bust. And it seems to me that if he were in truth a reporter, he would have said to someone, is that bust out for repair or something? And he would have been corrected. The fact that he reported it suggests he wanted to say, oh, look, they've taken down a bust of a liberal person. So that seemed flawed to me. But my real question has to do with, what do you think will happen to people who have spoken for the president? I mean, presumably they have a life ahead of them, and they have defended these comments in ways we might consider unethical. What do you foresee for and I don't know the background of these people enough to know what they did.
Yeah. Well, one at a time. First of all, on your first point on the bust, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's inconceivable to me that a reporter entering the Oval Office with Obama as the new president and who didn't see a bust of Martin Luther King would write a story saying Obama took the bust of Martin Luther King out of the White House. Obviously, to some degree, that reflected a reporter's preconception that that was a possibility that this president would remove him. And I think the story was that they'd been replaced with Churchill or something. In his defense, and I don't really, I mean, he's apologized for this. He made a mistake, and whether it reflected a preconception or not, at least he's admitted that it was an oversight on his part. Only slightly in his defense, he was part of what we refer to as a pool report. When there's an event in the Oval Office or any other place where there's a constrained space, typically what presidents or other officials do is they'll invite a few representatives of the press to come in and just listen and observe, and then they report back out to the rest of the press, and the press can base it on that, what they call the pool report. He was a pool reporter that day. Pool reporters are not expected or allowed to ask questions. They are there to observe, and in this case, to observe incorrectly. So there's no defending a mistake, really, but he would not, given the circumstances under which he was in the office that day, he would not have been in a position to ask the Secret Service what was going on. Should he have asked them afterward? Probably. I'm sure he regrets that. To your question about sort of what happens to all these people, I don't know many of these people personally. As was mentioned earlier, I did a book with Leon Panetta a couple of years ago. In fact, I'm going to see him tomorrow. He knows a lot of these people personally and likes some of them, and I certainly won't speak for him. But, you know, I mean, I think what you see for the most part is people around him trying their best to stay up with a tempestuous personality. You know, McMaster, General McMaster, who spoke the other day, I think was extremely careful in what he said. What he said was, I think, misleading, but probably not incorrect. You know, the Washington Post reported a story that said Donald Trump gave classified information to the Russian representatives. Now, first of all, that's arguably semantically incorrect. It was classified material up until the moment that he spoke it, but the president can declassify material by speaking about it. So it's really not true to say it was classified up to the moment that he shared it, but it's arguable semantically anyway that it wasn't classified as he spoke it, because that had the effect of declassifying it. So was that wrong? Well, you be the judge. McMaster says yes, certainly Trump says it's wrong. And McMaster came out and said it was wrong, but didn't say why. The other thing McMaster did is he said the president never revealed sources and methods of American intelligence. Well, that's true, as far as we know, but the Post never said that he really said. So as I said to my students the other day, it's a little bit like the Post writing a story saying he's a bank robber and McMaster saying he's absolutely not a murderer. And it's like, well, yeah, gotcha. But does that damage McMaster? I heard a friend of his on the radio the other day worrying that this would cost his reputation in the long run to have to be sort of evasive in this way. You know, who knows what Sean Spicer does next? It probably will know fairly soon because I don't think he'll be there much through the weekend. But you know, this is hard. I think that people in the press get very frustrated with these people and these kinds of sort of manipulations or these evasions. On the other hand, there is a recognition that they work for the president and they're there to represent the president. And so I mean, I don't know Sean Spicer, I don't know General McManus, but I wouldn't hold it against them personally that they did this. I just would, I feel sort of sorry for them. But you know, this is true of any press operation. I think this one is particularly stressed, particularly at this moment. But you know, Nixon's people went on to lead productive lives. You know, Haldeman came back to California. I mean, so yeah, I don't think this is the end of the run for them. Is what I guess what I'm saying.
Would you comment on whether you think there's been a decline in in-depth?
Push up the bottom.
Would you comment on whether you think there's been a decline in in-depth investigative reporting? A few years ago, there was a concern expressed with the rise in social media, the decline in the employment and the resources that newspapers might have, that might occur. How do you see it?
Yes, I think the answer is I am concerned, and I think there is some evidence of it. I mean, the material you saw earlier is all true. I mean, and it is also true that the Los Angeles Times that I came to, 1,280 is the news staff that I recall joining. Now it's between 400 and 500, and the simple math is that you just can't do as much with 400 or 500 people as you can with 1,300 or 1,200. And that's true across the LA Times has, for a variety of reasons, I think, been particularly hard hit by all of that. But it's not unique in it. It's an industry problem, not an LA Times problem. So glass half empty, I would say yes. Long term, I mean, the fact is that there's more ways to express oneself directly. I mean, I have a very good friend who's a very successful comedic actress on television. She has more Twitter followers than the LA Times has readers. So that's weird, right? I mean, that's a different environment for sure. She doesn't do any investigative reporting, I can promise you that. She and my wife are on a plane together as we speak. So that, and investigative reporting takes a long time, and it's very hard, and it's very expensive. At the height of the Iraq War, this is not investigative reporting, but foreign reporting, at the height of the Iraq War, the Los Angeles Times was spending $1 million a month to keep a Baghdad bureau open. Well, most bloggers can't do that. you know? And so I do think things will be lost. There's another conversation to have about local versus national in all of this. I think one of the endemic problems of sort of writing for clicks and writing for readership is that you tend to ignore local stuff because there's fewer people in California than there are across the world, and so the national stuff gets more clicks. So there are a lot of different problems within that, all of which are serious, and probably the most precarious of which is serious long-term investigative reporting. On the other hand, just to be more positive, what's going on between the New York Times and the Washington Post today is a spectacular example of a newspaper war benefiting the American public. That every day, literally every 6 hours, one of those organizations, and to a lesser degree other people too, but those two organizations are breaking news at a clip that I have not seen, and by the way, that far exceeds Watergate. People like to think back on Watergate and compress it in time. It did span over the course of almost 3 years. This is all happening. He's only been president for 5 months. I mean, so stuff is coming out very fast. There's a lot of good sourcing. Invariably what happens is a story comes out, everyone denies it, and by morning, everyone's agreed that it's true. And so this is all happening very quickly, and it's a real testament to the fact that these newspapers, despite struggling, have a lot of life left in them. And so I think it's not over yet. The long-term trends are worrisome for sure, but I think there is still a lot of important investigative work happening, and in fact, we're seeing it almost literally every day.
You've lived through several ownership changes at the Times.
Dear God.
I'm concerned about the various ownership effects on the media.
You and me both, bud.
Could you comment on that?
Yes, I will. Well, listen, I'm struggling to sort of figure out how far back to go to answer. Without elaborating, there's a period when I first came to journalism, the kind of model that was then on the wane but still in place was family ownership of the most reputable papers. The Chandlers owned the LA Times, the Sulzbergers didn't exactly own but had controlling interest in the New York Times. The Graham family was largely responsible for the Washington Post. That has sort of ebbed away. I think the Sulzbergers may still have, if not a controlling interest, at least a very dominant interest in the New York Times. But for the other papers, they're disappeared. They're publicly traded, etc. There's good aspects of that and bad, unhappily more bad than good, in my view. But with family ownership came family interests. The Los Angeles Times. When I was the editorial page editor of the Los Angeles Times, we endorsed Barack Obama for president in 2008. It was the first time in the history of the Los Angeles Times that we'd ever endorsed a Democrat for president, and that's largely because the Chandler family, through the first 120 years of the existence or whatever it was of the LA Times, was a Republican family and insisted that the paper toe a Republican line. Now, that's good if you're a Republican, it's not so good if you're a Democrat, but it's, in any case, it was one of the products of family ownership, was that kind of domination. On the other hand, what that gave is a real insulation from the vagaries of the economy. That as long as you have a family that is willing to accept a 2 or 3% return, the LA Times makes money. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's made money ever since I joined it anyway. And that's true of most papers. No one's actually, a few papers are actually losing money, but for the most part, they're making much less than they used to. And in a family-owned environment, that's not that important if the family's willing to accept less. In a publicly traded environment, it is, because investment goes elsewhere. So I think newspapers are much more susceptible to the ups and downs of the economy than they used to be. They're more susceptible than most institutions to economic changes, because they are so heavily dependent on retail, which is very susceptible to swings in the economy. And they're on a clear downward trajectory. That family ownership or personal ownership might help stave off, but that corporate ownership won't, and in some ways responsibly can't. I mean, it's no secret that I think a lot of people in this town hope that a local owner will someday emerge and buy the LA Times and own it outright. I happen to know Eli Broad fairly well, and I know that he's contemplated it for a long time. He's even tried at one point. The bigger problem is convincing Tronc, as they call it, to sell. ownership is complicated. And again, to finish on a slightly more positive note, as I tried to, I was editorial page editor for however many years, 2008 to 2011 or so, I forget exactly. But I will say this. I worked for a couple different owners in that period, including Sam Zell, who is pretty much the most atrocious person I have ever had to deal with. He's a horrible little man. But in any case, he never, ever, he complained about everything, but we endorsed Barack Obama, notwithstanding the fact that I knew that he supported John McCain. He never complained about it. We actually even supported on our page a proposition that he had given money he'd given money in favor of it. We came out against it and bracketed in a sentence saying that we recognized that he was one of the principal donors on the other side. I waited all day for the phone to ring and never did. So while corporate changes of ownership have brought different kind of sensibilities to the paper, to LA Times and others, I do think there's still a kind of bedrock understanding that the newsroom shouldn't be run by, its politics shouldn't reflect that of its ownership. That's obviously not true of all news organizations, but I think the newspapers, anyway, that I've worked at and that I'm familiar with, that remains a fairly bedrock conviction. The bigger problem to my mind is not that these changes of ownership change the politics of these papers, but that they change the support and the lifeblood of them. And so the paper gets thinner and thinner. It's not so much that it gets more conservative or more liberal, it gets smaller, and that has its own negative effect. And I'm afraid, at least for the moment, nobody has seen a way out of that.
Yes, regardless
Sort of out of our allotted time, but Bill will give you the last question.
Oh, wonderful. This is following up on that. Regardless of ownership, the economics of the marketplace are such that there's an inevitable direction that we're heading in. What role do you see the Los Angeles Times playing in the next 5 years or beyond that?
What a nice note to end on. Listen, the LA Times was, and I think will be the most important news organization on, west of the Hudson River, and therefore has real responsibilities that it continues every day to do its best to live up to. It's under enormous pressure to do that, and I think it will find it harder and harder, candidly. Here's the business conundrum, the economics as you refer to it. And I'm not up to date on the numbers. It's been a couple of years since I've been there or been a department head and been privy to budgets, et cetera, and I probably shouldn't tell them to you even if I did. But in any case, it's publicly known fact that the vast majority of the newspaper's revenue comes from the print product. That product is shrinking in terms of revenue and readers. The web piece is growing, but it's very small in terms of what it generates for revenue. And there's a reason for that, and we don't have time to do it today, but we have an advertising model that's fundamentally local. And if you own a Macy's on Wilshire Boulevard, you don't really care that 50,000 people read the Los Angeles Times in Europe, because they can't come to your Memorial Day sale. So even though there's more people read the LA Times than any point in its history. So there is appetite for journalism. The problem is that the business model that developed to support print papers doesn't transfer nicely to the web. That's a problem that's true for all papers. Some are weathering it more easily than others. Some are better equipped to take on what limited national advertising there is on the web and make the most of it. And some very small papers have escaped relatively unscathed because they never had national advertising, so that when it disappeared, it didn't really hurt them. So there's a lot of things in play here. But in the bottom line is I think the paper is staffed by incredibly dedicated people, much younger than when I came there. It's a very different looking staff who really do understand the significance of the Times as a social, cultural, political institution, and therefore will continue, I think, to be the dominant and important news source for this region and beyond. I think they will find it harder and harder. I just don't think, until someone solves this business problem, and it may be solvable, but there is no relief as long as the revenue is dropping and the increased readership over here is not bringing new revenue with it. I mean, the very short answer here, here's the business model of every American newspaper today, including the LA Times. We want you to pay for it. We want you to subscribe to it. But if you don't, we'll give it to you for free anyway. And then, lo and behold, lots of people say, well, shit, I'll take it free. And so it's very hard to get people to pay for something that a whole generation of people has grown up not paying for it. It's very hard to figure out a way to get them to pay for it. So that's a business problem. I should emphasize, though, that is not, in my mind, a journalism problem. That is not, the fact that more people read it than ever is evidence that there still is appetite for the journalism of it. It's just monetizing that is incredibly difficult on the web. And that's true of the LA Times, but it's true of others, too.
All right, let's give Jim Newton a big hand. Thank you.
Wait, I want your remarks about the Hudson. I want to read the truth.